Right.
I just wanted to say I've not had enough time to set up sharing my screen, so Martin won't be able to see the resolutions.
Just keep with the leave of the councillors, I'm going to move the agenda 9.3 to be the current agenda 9.1. So we have Brandy Griffin, Principal Policy Advisor, Climate Change. And Ninka, yours.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you once again for having us here this morning. Just a few points that I wanted to say at the start, although of course I assume that you've had a chance to look at the paper. What we're asking you today is that we consider the adoption of the climate framework and also that we consider this report that I'm proposing. One thing that I did want to say is we have discussed some of the ongoing work in briefings, but I was conscious of the fact that I had not actually through a council paper put together the idea of a more formal report that we would do. And in briefings, what I've talked to you about is how for each activity that we do, I have begun to compile what has been happening in the last 3 years in relation to climate change, and what is it that we are doing over the next 3 years through the long-term plan, and then some for many of our activities. And we've had discussions with the communications team about once I start to compile this information, how do we present it to the public? How do we make it transparent? What do we do with that? One thing that it may not yet be in your the hub, the Dropbox. I forget the title of your Dropbox, the councillor shared Dropbox. Yeah. I put as an example what Palmerston North City Council did last year with their report. This is just an example. And what I wanted to suggest is that we would, of course, continue to work with you in the development of such a report. Of course, many councils have done things along these lines, and we would do our Capity version, but that's just to give you an idea of what I was thinking. So we have talked about in briefings these compilations that I'm pulling together. This now is becoming the second request I'm making of you today is how do we pull it together and make it transparent for the public? So I also wanted to remind you, of course, this is not the only thing that we would be doing once we've adopted the framework. As you know, Ninka and I have a whole program of work that we will do that, you know, continues to work to embed this across council. And we're really pleased that now that the LTP has been adopted, our communications team is having more space to work with us to develop a more detailed communication and engagement plan, because I think one of the messages we consistently get in regards to climate change is we need to be transparent and let tell our story to the public. So with that, over to you.
Can I test this going forward as to how resilient or nimble your framework would be by asking you to express your opinion on when an issue pops up, like we made a decision, the long-term plan on the recycling center. Now we have members of the public saying otherwise, which is a good thing because we're still pursuing better delivery in waste minimization associated with climate change impacts and stuff. How would your framework manage an issue like that?
I have to say that even though I know you had not yet adopted this framework, I was really thrilled to be listening to some of the public speakers this morning that were making reference to the framework. Across council, all the staff that everyone that I know working across council, we are all working really hard. We are all trying to do the best that we can. And when we plan any project, we begin to think about early on what's the best approach, what level of engagement is required, etc. Often, well, I think for the most part, we hit the mark. I think that for the most part, we do sufficient engagement. We work with the community and the community are pleased. What I thought was great about people referring to the framework was that that's an example of how they can use that and say, this is an area where we felt that we would have liked some more information. And as a result, from what I heard, there will now be a report that is written and we will continue that discussion. So in my opinion, that is, correct me if I'm wrong or if others disagree, but that is the perfect example of how the framework should work and how we just continue to use that as an opportunity. If the public feels that maybe they didn't have enough say or we didn't get it right, we bring it back again and we talk about it at the chambers. So I think for the most part, we will be able to give effect to the framework. And if there are instances where the public feels that we haven't, they'll let us know and we'll remedy that.
I'm well aware that the huge range of work that's been starting to happen across council's activities underpinned by carbon emission and adaptation issues. I just wanted to know, in the politics of trying to be nimble, responding to councils, different councils have got their portfolios, they want to pursue some things. How does that enable us in a dynamic political atmosphere, which is going to get even more dynamic as months come up, how this framework is nimble enough to provide long-term sustainable solutions rather than knee-jerk immediate reactions?
Once again, I might need to defer to our chief executive or my group manager, but one thing that is interesting is through the framework, the actual decision making that we make in regards to any of these activities, projects, programs that we propose do take place through the long-term plan, the annual plans, the district plan. So that continues to work alongside. So even in this instance, from what I understand, we may have made a decision through the long-term plan. Now, if there is any thoughts about considering that or revisiting it, we have time to work on that, and we use the formal process that exists to make any changes or corrections following that.
Thank you, that's clear. Any other questions? Waiting. None. Councillor Randall.
I just want to compliment the paper, compliment the writers of the paper.
Councillor Randall, did you hear the response to my questions? So the paper is flexible enough to provide guidance on political issues as they pop up. Martin, have you got a question? No? Are you feeling better? He sits over all of us.
I agree with Bernie with regards to the quality of the report, and also just like to comment on the work that the staff have done, because they do put a lot of hard work into this scenario, and would be very interested in Councillor Hanford's comments, that being her portfolio.
Right, if there are no other questions, and I know Councillor Hanford is wanting to move the recommendation, but she's got an additional 35.
Yeah. So, yeah, I'm happy to move the recommendations with an additional recommendation.
Can you put your mic on?
Oh, sorry. Yeah. Thank you. So I'd like to move the recommendations with an additional recommendation that Council requests the development of an updated climate change report to occur each year thereafter. So as kind of a subset of recommendation 34.
So it's a subset of, and
yeah, so
are you saying it's an addition to 34?
Yeah, so following the climate change report that will be presented to Council for adoption before the end of this financial year, that an updated report is presented each year thereafter back to Council.
Okay, so you're moving 33 and the amended 34.
Yeah,
yep.
the addition. So just to make sure that one also comes back to us before the end of this financial year to be included in there too, yeah.
So can I ask whether we Seconder, Councillor Buswell. Debate. Right of introduction, sorry.
Yeah, sure, might as well. So I am incredibly proud of where we have come to and kind of grown through, I guess, in developing these principles to the Climate Emergency Action Framework that we have in front of us today. I know that members of the Kāwhiti Climate Change Action Group and Low Carbon Kāwhiti would have loved to have been here today. Mainly actually just to commend us as councillors, and also to commend the staff on actually getting to this point and having a really sturdy set of principles that we can, stand on as a foundation to continue doing the mahi that we do as council, and to evolve through and front foot action on both mitigating and adapting to climate change. It's also a really important moment in ensuring that climate change is integrated throughout within all mahi of us as council. It's an important moment for us to be thinking about the 7th generation, to be thinking about why we're all here and why we're making these decisions, and the fact that there will be many other people who sit around these tables, and the fact that we're now implementing something like this that will hopefully be sustained throughout councils that follow us is quite exciting. So I would just like to mihi to Brandy, Ninka and Sean and the rest of the team, and I really appreciated the opportunity to feed into this and to make comment before the paper came back to council today for adoption of these principles. I'm really grateful too that changes have been made based on kōrero with iwi, and I'm really looking forward to seeing how the framework and the principles within the framework allow us to continue to build on and strengthen our relationship with our mana whenua partners. So again, a mihi to Kāwhiti Climate Action Group, Low Carbon Kāwhiti, School Strike for Climate Kāwhiti, the Youth Council, who also made a very strong submission on this, and also to the Save Our Recycling Target Group for really already holding us to account on these principles, and I hope that many other members of our community will continue to do that. So I just challenge all of us really to unite behind these principles and to be proud of these principles and to actively communicate them to Arohi, to our community, because I think that's our responsibility as elected members, as leaders, as communicators, facilitators, whatever we call ourselves, connectors, to actually be a part of communicating the importance of taking action on climate change, thinking about the generations that come and how our decisions now will impact them. So I now think that it's great, well hopefully, if we all are in support of the paper today and the recommendations today, that our community has a really strong reference point to hold us to account in terms of action on the climate emergency, and the fact that we'll be getting those yearly reports back to us as council to keep this on the agenda as, potentially an intermediary until we have more of a kōrero about what some kind of structured committee, or I don't even know, would look like. But this is a great way of beginning that conversation that desperately needs to be begun. So in essence, just proud of where we've come to and how we're going to continue growing through this. And I would like to also just mention a quick whakatauki. Poipoia te kākano kia puawai, nurture the seed and it will blossom. That's the way I see these principles, this framework, is that if we continue to nurture them, enact them, stand on them and grow from them, we'll continue to nurture the seed that is the sustainability and the resilience of Kāwhiti, and continue to nurture it for not only us but generations that follow. So I just am really proud of the mahi that staff have done. I'm proud of us for all being bold in action on tackling the climate emergency, and we just have to make sure we continue doing that through every decision that we make, because ultimately that's our responsibility, but also a great opportunity to make Kāwhiti a better place. Kia ora.
To talk all of that except one little thing, and that's we have already begun the work. It's not work that urgently needs to be begun. I think I'm proud of our where we've come to as a council up until this point as well, and I think this builds on that. When we declared this climate emergency, and along with many other councils in the country, we were criticised for it being an empty and meaningless kind of action, but I think this shows that it wasn't. It's led to us developing these principles which are going to be embedded right across what we do, and we've tried to embed these principles in the past, and I think we're going to be doing that much more now with this framework in place. I'd like to congratulate Sophie and the staff on the work that they've done on this. And I think what's been really, really valuable in this discussion too is the connections that Sophie brings to the table. In all those groups that she's mentioned, she has really close connections as a councillor and also as an activist in this space with all of those groups. So that brings immense value to this conversation, and it will continue to do so. And it's particularly good that this work around mitigation and the seriousness with which we take that is happening alongside our work with the Coastal Advisory Panel, which is nearly formed, and the work that's going to happen around adaptation as well, and that those two things can happen side by side in this council. I think we're in a really strong position in terms of our climate change response. So congratulations to all involved.
Councillor McCann.
Well, thank you, Mayor. I'd just like to congratulate the staff on the fantastic work they've done, and also on Councillor Handford for continuing to raise the bar in how we speak to these reports. I think we're becoming all too eloquent and leaving some of us like me behind. I think the challenge with that eloquence is that we need to ensure that Council continues to send out the right messages. And we've had a long debate, and I was one of those who suggested that when we were closing or suggesting the closure of the recycling and waste, we were sending out the wrong messages because we hadn't discussed and come up with a way of communicating the reasons for that and how, whether they supported or didn't support this type of work. So I think there are tangible examples of where as a council we can do better. That definitely is one, but I congratulate you on this report. I think this is standing us in good stead.
Councillor Elliott.
Thank you. I prepared my speech for this morning, and I'm going to say it anyway. But I'd like to support the Papaka Waikanae and the Waikanae Community Board at the moment. Where the demographic of Waikanae has limited accessibility, and they're a unique part of our demographic. They're mostly older people, and they have every right of choice to take part in climate change initiatives, and that includes reducing their rubbish to the point, like so many of us can do, that they don't even need a curbside bin or a recycling, all they want to do are recycling bins. They don't need the $400 a year bill. All they need to do is just pop a bag in the recycling facility. I'd just like to say that as portfolio leader for sustainable waste management, I personally feel that the $123K spent every year to keep that facility going is very, very well spent money in the waste management budget. When you put that alongside our waste education, and when you put that alongside the initiatives and the grants we give out, the waste levies, that's really well spent money. And if it helps and assists 10,000 people to reduce their waste to landfill and to recycle, that's really well spent money, councillors. And to close it, I believe, is really, really counterproductive to our climate change aspirations. We're all sitting here today having our proud moment and using very, very self-congratulatory words. And it's interesting, they're all the right words, and you all talk the talk. But can you walk the walk? And I'm afraid today has proven that no, you can't walk the walk. And I believe anyone who votes for this table after this morning's show is being completely and utterly hypocritical. I'm finished.
Now, allow me to add to minimize it, it'll be 2 cents, not 5 cents. This report is really good because it creates a framework within which a community conversation can be held. A conversation that is linked to the ratepayers' pockets. A conversation that's related to global issues, which we have a moral responsibility. We also have legal responsibilities. So there is a way of doing this. And I congratulate Councillor Handford in the way she's connected the responsibilities as a portfolio holder, representing the council's position, pushing the council forward by reflecting on what the pressures that are coming from activists and people who are more concerned than others because they are more informed as what the dangers are that's shaping up and challenging us. The last few weeks we have seen what's happening around the world. So we have people, so your ability to connect those two and inform council from what the grassroots organizations are saying, and ability to work constructively towards resolutions is appreciated. So with that, I also congratulate the staff in the response to the paper, and I know the direction of my questioning before is to elicit from staff that the framework they're providing us can manage political buffering that can happen and will increase in the months to come. I support your resilience in the face of that, and thank you for the work that you've done. With that, I'm going to put recommendation. Oh, write a reply. From that, recommendation 33 and the amended 34 is up on the board there. Moved by Councillor Hanford, seconded by Councillor Buswell. All those in favour say aye. Aye. Those against? You're abstaining. You want that recorded? Yep. Carried. Back to item 9.1, transport bylaw. Page 6. Susan Glenn, yours.
Kia ora, Suzanne Rushmere, Access and Transport, just to present the Transport Bylaw report. If Council is comfortable, I'd just like to take the report largely as read. The report includes the statement of proposal that identifies the need to review the Traffic Bylaw 2010, sets out the changes between the 2010 and the proposed 2021 bylaw, outlines the process we've undertaken so far, and identifies the next stages of the process in terms of consultation under special consultative procedures and hearing of submissions at a later date. I included a tracked change version to identify the changes between the 2010 and 2021 bylaw, but I'm appreciative that this looks a little bit messy and confusing, which is why you also got a clean version so you could easily read it. I'm aware there's a number of grammatical and typographical errors in the report that needs fixing, and doesn't change the content or the direction of the bylaw. It just doesn't. There's a couple of S's where there should be D's and D's where there should be S's, and things like that. So that will be fixed before the statement of proposals released publicly, should the council approve a recommendation to consult on the transport bylaw in August to September.
Questions? Councillor Coates.
Morning, team. The typos and other little grammatical stuff aside, there's a couple of points that I just wanted to check, and always happy to be told that I'm wrong, because I'm not entirely sure that I'm right. On point number 24, it refers, so that's page 16 of the report, page 7, I think, of the statement of proposal. It refers to the Disability Action Group. Is it a group that's different to the Disability Advisory Group?
I think I just took the wrong.
Okay, I wasn't sure.
The Disability Advisory Group that Claire Rowie supports.
Awesome, cool. Okay, and the other one, which I don't know if I'm being pedantic about it, but it refers to, on page 12 of the councillor report, around hearing submissions and feedback. It refers to speaking directly to councillors, informing councillors and so forth, and I don't know technically whether the mayor is a councillor as well as a mayor, but I don't know whether we change the wording to say mayor and councillors, or the council or so.
members.
Yeah, or
Elected
elected
members,
members, because it
which
reads
means
as if
community
the information is just coming to councillors,
Elected representatives.
although the mayor may not want to be included, I don't know.
An error on my part, which I will fix.
Yeah, and that's it from me. Other than the other stuff, I'll just share through to you offline.
Brilliant.
Councillor Elliott.
Thank you very much. I'm pretty sure I flipped through an email during the week about this question. It's just referring to page 46, point 7.3 and 7.4, and it's 46 of our agenda or page 14 of the draft. Does that address trucks using centre lanes to park and carry out loading and offloading activity adequately at this point? And if that's a legal activity now, then I apologise for not knowing that.
No, it doesn't, and the reason it doesn't is that my microphone seems to not be working. I'll try and shout louder. The reason it doesn't is it's covered under the Land Transport Rule 2004, so we don't need to duplicate what's in other legislation. And even if we wanted to, change it, we probably would find that a struggle because we need to be consistent with the higher order legislation. So it's actually in the 2004 Road User Rule, which comes under Land Transport. I will respond again. Quick response: it's covered by other legislation, which is the land, the Road User Rule 2004.
Just to Democratic Services, I see here Rachel Haggerty on line 8. I think she's from yesterday's meeting. The Health Strategy Committee met here. Rachel Haggerty.
Yeah. Thank you.
Sorry. Are you done? I was thinking. Councillor Holbrook.
Thank you. Look forward to this, and I particularly welcome the change in the title to transport rather than traffic. Really appropriate. I was just wanting to just touch on a little bit how this ties in with the report says that it does tie in with the regional transport strategy and the wider kind of framework. But I'm just keen to just have a little bit more information as to how that informs this.
So I guess there's a couple of things, and it relates to a change in central government direction. So there's much more of a shift towards different modes other than the private car, measures to address climate change, and the national policy statement, urban development, and all of which kind of need a response from us in terms of making sure that we can effectively manage our network to address some of the potential effects of some of those things. So, for example, with the NPS, there could be overspill parking on the road as a result of lack of provision on site, which we'd need to try and manage. We want to make sure that our modes have the ability to, we don't have the ability to create mode shift, and part of that is ensuring that there's the right rules in place to support that mode shift. So making sure that, we've got cycle lanes that are available only for cycle lanes or cycleways, walkway bridles, ways are safe, that our network's safe, and that we address safety effects to do with, parked cars that are causing problems. But also to allow for things like special lanes like bus lanes and high occupancy vehicle lanes, if council so decided, just to support that mode shift that's coming through from a direction from the RLTP and the higher order documents from the government.
Thank you. And second question, if I may, through you, Mr. Chair. So with the consultation process, we've recently done a consultation process where we did manage to reach people who don't usually reach council. So this is the kind of first thing we've had come to the table that requires that wider consultation since. Are we kind of learning from that work, and this might be a question for the wider team, in terms of informing how we approach the community? And I'm particularly thinking of commuters as well with this piece of work.
Yeah, absolutely. We're actually in the process of finalising the communications plan with our comms team at the moment, so those kind of things will be picked up as part of that.
Fantastic. Thank you.
Janice.
Thank you, through you, Mr. Mayor.
think Councillor Holbrook is possibly referring to the community research undertaken to inform the representation review process, which did use design research techniques that, and it is, I guess, a little bit of a test case or a proof of concept for us in terms of how we might be able to use that approach more broadly. So certainly we will be working with activity managers across the business to identify the projects in which some of those approaches might be a helpful part of our overall engagement and research mix.
Right. No other questions.
Sorry, Mr. Mayor.
Councillor Pravanov.
Yeah, so I actually have quite a few questions on. First of all, on page 37, I'm just going through checking on the pages. 3.1, there's a new bit that's been added in there, and activities, and I'm just wondering if I could have clarification of what that means, because this is about traffic by page 37, 3.1. No, 37.
Just trying to find it on my
It's in the objectives and scope. Should be S for objectives too, I think. I don't know.
So it includes things like, trading in public places. We get quite a few requests to trade with coffee carts and such like in public car parks and on legal roads. So it's basically saying that it's not just about traffic, it's about other activities that take place, which could include, trading in public places.
So, okay, so I understand that, but I'm just wondering whether, like you've got further down the line, about whether it's better to actually direct that to another bylaw that covers those matters?
So there is a public places bylaw and a trading in public places policy, and the reason for putting that in there was just to try and make sure there was some consistency between the two bylaws and support that trading in public places bylaw through the traffic bylaw or the transport bylaw.
Okay. So then 3.6 on the same page, there it actually notes it's got the speed limit bylaw 2015. So this bylaw, I assume, will last for 10 years. Is that correct?
Not necessarily. At the moment, central government is just consulting on the speed limit rule. So the outcome of that process may have implications for what the bylaw looks like at council. It doesn't mean that you can't also review bylaws before that sort of 10-year period is up. It just sets that the bylaw is in place until 2025, and there is an opportunity, I think, to be able to review that bylaw prior to 2025.
Yes, I suppose what I was, maybe I should have rephrased my question a bit better. So that you've got the speed limit bylaw of 2015. So if that bylaw, the speed limit bylaw, is actually changed, having it referenced in this document, it's going to make a nonsense of it. So I'm just wondering about not necessarily referring to the year, but just generally that bylaw.
In other places, we've said or its successor, so we can look at that language as well. And I think that through the bylaw, from the advice I got from the policy team yesterday was that it's kind of implied that its successors would also be sort of captured in that sort of process as well. So I can check on that. Yeah.
Okay, so then 7.3, which I'm just scrolling through, is on page. Yes, so this is about, we had a conversation about parking on berms. So prior written permission to a authorised officer. So how, because there's no forms attached with, to this. I couldn't see a form. How easy is it for a person to actually ask to park on a berm? Because obviously it's, it happens quite a lot, and I suppose then that moves into the fact that, you talk about signage. Is there going to be signage in old berms to say that people can't park there? And in reality, if people do park there, how well is it going to be enforced? There's a number of bits to do with parking on berms.
So I think there's a couple of things. That the reason that was put in there was to provide some clarity around what that meant. So previously we had, no parking in the road margin. So that was included just to identify and provide clarity on what that meant. So that's not much of a change from the previous bylaw. In terms of enforcement, obviously that's the responsibility of a different team, but by putting this in, it provides better opportunity to enforce going forward. And we do get requests for a number of different ways for activities within legal road, and that can come through service requests. It can come through direct requests from the applicant. So we could, through the bylaw, say that it has to be done through a prescribed form, and we can provide a copy. We could produce a copy of that prescribed form, but currently it comes in a number of different formats when we receive those requests.
So I suppose I'm trying to look at it in terms of fairness here. So I think a lot of people do park on berms, and I think they probably genuinely believe that they can do. And so how are people going to be informed and be continuously informed that they're not allowed to do that, rather than just suddenly get a ticket, whereas someone down the road might have been doing it for some period of time and they never have done? It's about consistency.
So I think from the perspective of the bylaw, this is a proposed bylaw that's going out for consultation. We're not sure yet whether or not the wording will appear in the final version as it is in the proposed. It gives people the opportunity to comment on the proposals. And obviously, when the final bylaw is produced, we will make sure that the comms plan is identifying some of these areas when that's published.
Okay, so there's a couple of places in the document, 8.1 and 12.3, for example, where it talks about resolutions. And for some of them it says publicly notified, and some of them that's been crossed out. So I'm just wondering why that has happened in some places and it hasn't in others, or whether that is something that has just been overlooked.
Something's been overlooked as part of the document, so that will be addressed through picking up those typos. It doesn't always have to be publicly notified, and I will take further legal advice on which bits do and which bits don't.
Okay, so sorry, I do have some more. 24.3 relates to works on berms. Hold on, mate. 20. Yes. Page 55. No person shall undertake any works on the road or road margin, including digging, planting, without the prior permission of an authorised officer. So does that actually include a berm?
Sorry, which was the
it's 24.1, page 55.
Yeah, road margin does include the berm. It's basically edge to boundary to boundary.
So it's my understanding that it's the resident who lives there, it's their job to actually maintain that. So you're saying that they've actually got to ask for permission to mow it?
No, not mow. No. It largely relates to digging and planting rather than mowing, which is why I tried to set that out. Identify those two things in the clause.
Yeah, so I think there probably needs to be slightly clearer. So there was also 26.1, which was about stock. No person is, I think this area, maybe we just have to wait for people to respond to this.
Robin, can I go to Councillor Compton and then come back to you?
If you like, but I do have some more questions.
Councillor Compton.
Thank you. Through the Mayor, it's picking up on Councillor Pravano's questions around the berm parking. We've obviously got a lot of smaller streets, especially say in Paraparaumu Beach and Waikanae Beach and Raumati, where there's no footpaths, the road's quite narrow, there's limited off-street parking. So the only option for people, and say tradespeople who are visiting a lot of these houses, is to actually park on the berm. Otherwise, they're going to block the road. So would it be better if we had, say, designated areas where we would apply that, where there is, where there are actually other reasonable parking options, or are we sort of, I guess, trusting authorised officers' discretion in terms of enforcement on this?
Through you, Mr. Mayor, I think the later. We are trusting some discretion from authorised officers. It gets very hard to put a line on the map and have a designated area, and discretion is used in that situation.
I think that's also why I tried to put that sort of bit in, otherwise, approved by council, because it provides some flexibility around that where that's necessary. Part of the reason that we want to protect the berms is that we've got services running underneath them. And so, we want to make sure that whatever is underneath isn't being impacted by heavy loads that it's incapable of taking on top. So that's kind of where some of this direction is coming from in terms of the berm. I said it's no different really to where it was in the previous bylaw. It's just providing some more clarity for people around what that means.
The draft has references to the National Policy Statement on Urban Development. I haven't gone through the document fully. Am I correct in thinking that this bylaw will cover the increasing challenges to finding parking areas given the National Policy Statement's reduction of parking requirements for new developments?
I think that was certainly the purpose of some of the proposals and providing that additional clarity. It is an issue that Council is going to have to be addressing. As I said, we're already receiving applications that are seeking to provide a lower level of provision than perhaps we would have seen in the past. We have, as Councillor Compton pointed out, quite narrow roads, which isn't necessarily conducive to having parking and then trying to move in between. So I guess the idea behind the changes in here is to provide us with some support to address those effects. And we're also at the same time looking at a review of our subdivision development principles and requirements, which will also be looking at some of these issues.
Are we getting a feeling that there's going to be trouble for us looking ahead as the tension between continuing use of cars as a means of transport and the transition to public transport use, but in between we are going to get it?
It's difficult to predict. As this council's more than aware, we've been advocating for improved public transport in Kapiti for some time, and there's some movement on that from a point of view of recent announcements in terms of trains.
Has Councillor Mellon a view on this?
Yeah, can Sean or I give you an answer? The answer is yes. Yep.
Do we, in the public discussion, do we signal that strongly enough? Because we don't want to be, again, the person caught in between, whereas, government legislation, they churn it out. We are in the cold phase of this and we get it in the neck. The councillors around here will get it in the neck. So my question is, will this tension be signalled in the consultation going ahead?
I have signalled it in the statement of proposal, I think. Trying to find the page, but it talks about, but I can certainly, if you want me to make that stronger, I can certainly make that stronger.
Would it be the will of the councillors that we make that stronger? Yep.
Yeah, Mr. Mayor, I'm dealing with one, I've seen an application for a significant number of new units in a development where they've said, we basically won't provide parking. And then they've said, so what will the council do? We expect you to deal with our overflow. And I'm like, that is so not going to be the case. In my opinion, the NPS is all about metro provision of high-density, high-rise living where there's public transport networks that mean you should not have as much of a need for your own personal transport. And we're all caught up in it. And I do see a real risk of this turning into something ugly.
Councillor Buswell, then going back to Councillor Pravanov.
Just following on a little bit from Councillor Pravanov's questions around the boom and use of the road margins and things like that, and I'm just wondering in the communications plan whether we can really emphasise the why cars can't park on the boom, because it's, you know, people will just think that they'll, you know, there's nothing wrong with them parking on the boom, but they don't understand the infrastructure and things. In fact, Susan, you just referred to that just earlier when you were talking about it. So I think that that's a really important piece of work that the community need to understand and know.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So just going back to the sperms and so what we've heard in this today and what we've heard previously is it's the weight of the vehicles on the booms that causes the problems. And so I'm just wondering whether it's, because I think there's going to be a lot of comments about this in terms of whether it's better to limit the vehicles. Like I have to say, we live in a semi-rural area and I see council, trucks when they're collecting or doing stuff, driving on our booms. So it's a case of where even council staff trucks do that. So is damage being caused by cars, or is it actually more those heavy vehicles?
Certainly in the communications plan that we put out, we'll highlight the reasons. The reasons are numerous. Visibility for intersections, causing hazards, people that want to use the boom and the footpath being restricted, causing issues for people backing out of their driveways. So there's a raft of factors. Depending on how wet the booms are, depending where the booms are, light vehicles can and do as much damage as heavy vehicles. But we'll certainly beef that up as part of the communications plan.
Okay. So 21. I was selling and leasing goods here. So So I think 21.1's been changed a bit. So I'm just thinking about, for example, down Kapiti Road, you have car washes outside the old placemaker's place there. Are they going to be impacted by this or not?
The idea behind the changes in this one from the previous one was to provide some flexibility so that where those kinds of activities could be appropriate, that they would be able to be undertaken where currently they're not allowed to be.
So saying that they need to do they normally need to have a permit?
But this is just for roads. If it's on private property, then it would come under the RMA. But if it's on land that council owns or manages, it would come under this bylaw.
Yeah, so that's, there's car parking there, people drive along there, so that must be council land. So I'm just wondering.
Not necessarily. There's quite a significant number of our car parks that aren't owned or managed by council.
Okay. So also too, in terms it talks about plantings on booms requiring approval. So, given our climate change emergency and looking at the environment, people I think are probably at times trying to green more their booms. So are there any comments around, why there is a lot of control around planting? And does that include grass?
Certainly the fact that we allow planting by approval signals our intent that we're not discouraging it, but certainly much the same as parking on the booms, planting at times can cause visibility problems, can cause issues with services, can cause issues with overhead and underground services. So we're not saying no, you're not allowed, we're just saying we want to have a conversation and give written approval. Certainly in our district, and I think all districts, grass on booms fairly standard, and there's no issues with that.
Okay.
Typically.
Okay, so is there a fee if someone comes to you to ask about planting trees, one or two trees? Is there a cost associated with that?
Currently, there's not a cost, but certainly if there was a mind from council, it could be something that was dealt through fees and charges. But currently, no cost.
Okay, because I think often if there's a charge, then people think, well, I don't want to go down that route. So it's about getting the best outcome, really.
Noted.
Oh yes, now 20, 28.2. 28.2. Yeah, I don't understand this here. A form is not invalid. Is that good English?
That's actually carried across from the general bylaw, and I'm actually currently working through with Lisa Boyd at the moment from our policy team around whether that's actually necessary for this bylaw at all. It could be that it's actually removed from the final version.
Okay. And then you've got 29.3. It talks about being able to serve notices. And I'm just wondering whether it's actually that fair, if you can't find the person, whether you actually you give it to the occupier, because the occupier is irrelevant from the person or who needs to be served the notice.
Agree, and that's proposed for a deletion after speaking to Lisa in the policy team yesterday. These conversations have come about subsequent to the council paper, and so we've done a big legal revision of some of our standards, and so that's actually will be removed. And I'm happy to do that as part of the response to your comments. Now.
So on page 59, it's offences and breaches, and I suppose this here is very much, this is probably more generic stuff, and it's a lot of legalese, and I'm wondering whether it's of any benefit. And that's my first comment. It's a lot of all the things you can't do.
Yep. So again, this has been brought across from our general bylaw, and as part of the consultation process, we can look to see whether that can be made simpler and more clear.
So I'm just about at the end. So also in that section there, it talks about talking about the penalties are under the Land Transport Act and the Land under the Land Act. So I know when we considered the beach bylaw, the previous version referred to the various acts, and the fees for penalties was considered to be too high. And I suppose I'm just wondering whether or not the fee, what sort of fee structure we're looking at here, whether or not they're actually way too high for example, an enforcement officer not to actually want to apply them, and whether there's any option to actually have any charges that we can put in place.
So there's a couple of things that those charges are covered by a Higher Order Act, and I think there's some information in the statement of proposal around that and our inability to be able to change those fees under the Act.
Okay. So do you know what sort of fees they are?
Not off the top of my head, I'm afraid.
Okay.
Sorry.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. And so my very last point was in relation to, so when this goes to consultation, there's obviously going to be a form that people can fill in. That's not actually included in this document.
That's currently being finalised.
So do we get to see that before? Do we approve that?
That's just the standard submission form. I'm actually working through the online version at the moment with our comms team. I don't know if I'm able to suggest this or not, but I wonder whether we would be able to share those with the transport portfolio holder for approval.
Thank you. Thank you for the time that you've taken to consider my questions.
It was about booms, Mr. Mayor, and I think most of it's been covered. But there was one observation which I can phrase as a question. We have a lot of horses in Otahanga. Surely the shocks from horses on the booms is greater than someone parking on the boom in a road that actually has significant speed and people try and move off it to avoid being tailgated stationary. Is that true, that the horses would have more shock waves to the infrastructure underneath than vehicles parking on it? And I only raise this because I want to make sure that whatever we're going out to the public, the reasoning is sound, that we don't have something that doesn't make sense.
I honestly don't know the answer to that question.
And secondly, was the CE suggesting a ute tax? Because I'm sure I heard it.
Thank you, Councillor. I'm credited with many things. I'll happily take that one as well.
No, Mr. Mayor, I don't want a paper, but I just want to make sure that we don't go out with our reasoning and say it's about shops when we currently allowing and supporting horses to walk, trot on berms when canter. Sorry for not being specific. Not gallop. Which would actually create, in my layman's thinking, a bigger shockwave than a vehicle, a normal type vehicle, parking on a berm.
I think because of the size of the contact area and how that weight's dispersed and energy's dispersed.
There's been lots of comments around the berms, and we have lots of bylaws covering lots of activities across the district, not just roading and so forth. Could you clarify the intention of some of the, all of the rules and regulations within bylaws is in the event that it is needed, it is there. So, for example, the berms being a classic one, we're not going to be able to cover every single issue in every single street with every single type of mode of transport or small horses to donkeys and so forth. That simply the ability is there should something be an issue.
Absolutely.
Thank you. And lastly, I didn't mark it because it wasn't, but I think that because of the discussion, I'll just raise it. I can't remember where, but it was in the document around the changes to the parking through the government's national policy direction around parking, that it then says that council can develop parking plans and so forth in reaction. Could you clarify whether the government provided any funding to councils to be able to develop those parking plans in response to their changes in legislation?
The answer's no, and we actually raised that in our submission as well.
Thank you. So it goes back to your comment, Mr. Muir, around in the neck and and unfunded mandates and so forth. So in response to your earlier comment, I am happy to move the paper with amendments that have been raised and any minor editorial ones offline.
Right. No other questions in Councillor Coates' moved recommendation 25. Can I have a seconder? Councillor Hanford? Right or intro?
No.
Okay. Debate? No. All those in favour, recommendation 25 moved by Councillor James Coates and seconded by Councillor Hanford. All those in favour say aye. Aye. Those against? To item 9.2, elected members' remuneration, expenses and allowance policy 2019-22 update. I would like to remind councillors that under item 4, declarations of interest relating to items of the agenda, none of you all put your hand up on this one. I'm excluded because I didn't get a raise. Just saying.
Maybe it should be unilateral instead of
Diane.
Thank you, Mr. Mack. Good morning, everybody. So, at the beginning of the financial year, every year the Remuneration Authority issue a determination. And the determination defines what elected members will be paid for that financial year in terms of remuneration. And it also defines any allowances or expenses that may be paid to elected members. And what's presented to members today is the updated elected members' remuneration, expenses and allowances policy, which has captured those changes. The report explains the changes, but in a nutshell, things that I would like to highlight is The remuneration itself, with the exception of His Worship the Mayor, everybody gets a 1.5% increase for this council. There's a lot of councils who haven't received an increase at all. In terms of expenses and allowances, very little change. There is one section of the policy on page 92, 93 of elected members' papers, the communications technology section. Essentially, pretty much everything in that section is increased quite significantly, with one funny exception. And it sounds petty, but I will highlight it so there's no surprises for members. There are a few members who historically have put in an expense claim for ink cartridges, and we've covered that quite happily under incidentals, but this year, for the first time, the Remuneration Authority have actually defined that only up to $200 can be paid specifically per annum for ink cartridges. So while that may not sound like a lot of money, honestly, it's more than made up for by all the other increases that are in there around ICT and comms. So apart from that funny little example, I'm happy to take questions through the Mayor.
Questions? None. See, I told you, absolute silence. Oh, Councillor Holbrook.
I'm happy to move this, and I think I can negate my conflict of interest by stating that I will be donating my pay increase to the Mahara Gallery redevelopment project.
Oh, that means the project is completed now.
You want that project?
It's a conflict to that. It's a conflict.
No, it's not a conflict.
It is.
No. That's a bit of a stretch.
A positive conflict of interest. All right, you want to move that?
I don't own the building.
Anybody else? No questions. I will second that since I've got no conflict of interest. Right of intro. Wait, come on, scintillating debate. Councillor Compton, here we go.
I'll humour the Mayor, and it's just to make the point. It's just to make the point, because this often gets missed when the public sees these papers, is that the Remuneration Authority sets a pool of money that gets distributed to our councillors, and that we essentially vote on how that gets divvied up amongst us, but we have to divvy it all up. So when they increase that pool, we still have to vote on divvying it up. So I know every year you get the headline saying all councillors have voted themselves a pay rise. What happens is the Remuneration Authority determines that you'll get a pay rise, and you decide how it's split out amongst you. And the members are free to, as the Deputy Mayor has done, decide how they want to allocate that or spend that, as anyone can do with the income they earn from their work. So I just think it's worth highlighting that, because it's always one of those bugbears which always is fun at the start of a triennium, and especially so this year. I remember this triennium because the Remuneration Authority was finishing the catch-up work they'd done in that regard. So, yeah, that was all.
Right, and on my part, I would contribute my lack of interest to anybody's campaign coming year. Just saying. Councillor Coates.
Just following on from that discussion and Councillor Compton's comments about the Remuneration Authority, Councillor Holbrook mentioned what she's going to do with hers, and I'd encourage any elected member to consider doing something similar. I, protester previously, have every year to an Otaki Ward Councillor Scholarship, which has over the past 3 years seen at least half a dozen Otaki youth go into apprenticeships and so forth. So it's extremely rewarding. You'll have your own interests and things that you want to support within the community, and if you don't want it, it gives you the ability to be able to support something that you might not have necessarily been able to through the normal council process. So from my perspective, I think it's, I certainly in hindsight, it's been great, and I hope that when I'm no longer ward councillor, someone else continues it.
Councillor Elliott.
I just want to mention that for those of us that don't otherwise have other employment, I might just spend my 1.5% and give myself some KiwiSaver as elected members across the country are some of the very, very few people working in New Zealand who are not given the basic right of access to Kiwi, the opportunity to save KiwiSaver.
Right. Nobody else. Recommendation 22, moved by Councillor Holbrook, seconded by the Mayor. All those in favour say aye. Aye. Those against? Abstentions? No. Carried. Submissions on the government policy statement on housing and urban development. Welcome.
Kia ora everyone. Yes, just wanting to talk today about the submission on the government policy statement on housing and urban development. If it's all right with everyone, I'll take the paper as read and just open it up for questions through there.
Questions? Surprise. Councillor McCann.
Personally, and through you, Mr. Mayor, I personally think you should read the submission out to all councillors and all the public because it's that important. And I was reminded to read it, and I was very pleasantly surprised. I want to ask a couple of questions, though. We have clearly stated in the submission that while the government's work is laudable, it's pretty short on some suggestions. And then we do exactly the same to the government. We say that the market-driven approach with land doesn't work and don't give them any suggestions on how to fix that. Is that because it's just wading into territory that is just too politically dangerous for a council, or was there some other reason for that?
I think part of the reason for that is the level of feedback they're looking for from this document. So we are providing some feedback on the discussion document that's going to lead into the actual government policy statement. So we haven't seen the exact detail of that yet. So what they've been seeking in terms of feedback is sort of that high-level steer of whether they're going in the right direction and what kind of issues we'll see. So there's certainly more scope for more specific feedback in the future when we see the actual draft GPS. I think we do have in there some very sort of high-level recommendations around what different markets might look like, the sort of like build-to-rent type markets and those sorts of things, but it's still at quite that high level. Part of that's just because of the nature of the submission and the time we have to give it, and also the kind of our role in providing input and their role in trying to find solutions.
Build-to-rent from Britain there. Would you take councillors through, this is almost a question, some of the contradictions that the government policy directions are creating and how these can't be solved by council and the problems that they are going to cause for us?
I can point to a couple of the key ones I think is probably most helpful. The ones that we see being most at tension with what they're trying to achieve through this, the GPS, is around climate change. So obviously there's some clear directions from government around councils needing to plan around climate change and mitigate those risks. The clear direction around housing and wanting affordable housing and increased supply is at odds when you start to figure out what land is actually available once you take account for climate change. The same goes for the highly productive soils, which is still a draft national policy statement, but I know we've talked about quite a lot before. So those sorts of tensions are where some of those challenges are really going to lie. And
have we had feedback from other councils as to whether they've come up with the same issues that are suggested here?
We haven't had specific discussions around the submission, but there's been some ongoing regional discussions through the regional growth framework and those types of things that kind of make sure that we're all on the same broad page about where things are going, but yeah, we haven't specifically talked about the detail of the submissions.
Thank you very much, and it's really good to read that we're saying it's the government actions, as big as they are, not transformational enough.
James. Oh, is it Kathy? What was it?
Oh, okay. Thank you. I must apologise. I haven't had time to read it all. But I'm just speaking to 14.6. What additional or new expectations of Kainga Ora do you think should be included? I'm just bringing to the attention that around people with disability being able to access them. In Beach Haven, North Shore, Kainga Ora have built and are still building 72 apartments, social housing. They're 3 stories high. They're all concrete. They're in different blocks. But the only access to them is by concrete steps, although they are covered, and they're having problems leasing out the top story. So they need to ensure that they have access for people with disabilities in their housing.
Appreciate that you haven't read through the submission. We do address in the submission an issue around there's a focus in the discussion document about providing whole-of-life homes, whatever that might mean, and we've identified a tension between accessibility for people and providing cheap housing and potentially apartments or walk-ups, which tend to be cheaper to provide but have difficulty in access, and what the tension looks like between providing cheap and affordable housing and whole-of-life homes that might have additional accessibility requirements to make sure that they are actually fit for purpose. So we have, while we haven't talked about it specifically with Kainga Ora's role, we've talked about the concept of accessibility.
I understand that.
Yeah.
Councillor Compton.
Thank you. Through the chair, I noticed in the document we sort of talk about that we'd like the government to provide more tools, and this is something that Councillor McCann sort of touched on. But quite often we almost veer towards the funding being the issue. And I guess quite often the feedback we hear from central government to us is that local government has the tools in terms of our district plans and those sorts of things, but we're either not using them properly or we're too scared to use them. And I saw you mentioned urban development authorities in there. Are there any other sort of specific regulatory or legislative tools that you'd like to see the government bring out in the draft GPS when it comes out?
While it doesn't get entirely specific, one of the things we have identified is the need for supporting infrastructure, basically, and some of that is a role for council, and some of that is not a role for council. It's local government, regional councils or central government provisions. So making sure that that everything is lined up between the tools that we have access to and also the bits of the puzzle that aren't provided by us is one of the kind of key things that we're really looking for. To harp on about it, funding is a big issue for what we're doing, so it is still important that we put some focus on that as well in what we're doing. And just more clarity, I think, from central government about what they actually expect from us in this area is quite important, and so not necessarily a tool, but just more being clearer about where they see us fitting into that big system, and that gives us a better indication about what tools we actually need.
Cool. And just a follow-up one, sort of one of the government's aims in this, or their focus areas, is re-establishing housing's primary role as a home rather than a financial asset. And I guess one of the things that has been lost in the discussion around housing at the moment is that for a lot of people, especially small business owners, their home actually provides security either directly or indirectly for their business. So I'm thinking of cafe owners paying for a cafe fit out. Quite often that's secured either via their mortgage on their home, or they provide a personal guarantee to the business, which is effectively supported by their mortgage. So I think one thing that's probably useful to emphasise is around that housing, its primary focus is around housing people, but it does provide a supporting role and underpinning sort of, I think the small businesses are about a quarter of New Zealand's economy, and they employ 600,000 people, and it's access to that capital in housing that does enable a lot of that. And there's a debate to be had about to what extent that's a good thing or a bad thing, but the reality is, I know from my personal experience in small business banking, that essentially every deal that we did with a small business customer was linked back to their house in some way. I remember hugely successful New Zealand grown burger chain was setting up down in Wellington, and we all knew it was going to be wildly successful, but the only reason they could fund the quite expensive fit out of their flagship store was because of the fact that they had a mortgage on their house and there was equity in that to fund it. So there's that. Having a home as a house to house your family is that's brilliant, but then it actually enables people a lot more economic choices that flow on from that. It's not just the disruption from them having to move about regularly and that. It's sort of it's that basic building block to a lot of the economic independence we want people to enjoy too. So I think that encouraging that as something to be considered could be quite useful as well.
Yeah, noted.
Councillor Elliott.
Thanks. Is it Angela?
Yes.
Yeah, hi. I just wanted to know some of the building restrictions that are outlined in the MPSUD, and I did email you and just ask whether or not we adequately address some of the tensions that were brought up through the MPSUD in our own submission summary things.
Yes, thanks for sending that through earlier. So the DPS sits kind of above all of that. So it's we have kind of highlighted the issue of tensions in terms of government direction, but haven't provided any specifics because we can't actually affect any change in the MPSUD through the GPS. So it's more about getting clearer direction from government about how they want us to resolve those tensions rather than providing direct comment on the issues there. Yeah, thanks.
Right, no other questions. Can I assume that Councillor McCann, you want to move recommendation 26, seconded by Councillor Compton. Right of intro.
Thank you. I'd again like to congratulate staff on writing a well-written document, and would suggest to all councillors, if you haven't read it twice, it's a really good summation of the hugely complex area trying to ensure that the housing market and provision of homes is corrected. And Councillor Compton was very correct in picking up something there that we've talked about, that the government is trying to re-establish housing's primary role as a home rather than as a financial asset. And while I agree with him, I think what the government is talking about is the provision is one home being a financial asset, not multiple homes. And we've had a change in policy specifically around lending and interest deductibility that is focusing the public on and investors on building new homes rather than just hoovering up existing ones. So I commend the council on writing a really good document and submission, and it's incredibly complex, and I'm really looking forward to the government coming up with some of the answers, especially around the things you've raised around funding, which is a massive problem, and devolving the responsibility for council to provide all the infrastructure and be able to negotiate what our competing interests is actually, I would say, a cop-out, and the government has to make some of these decisions and give us some clear direction so that we are not the people who are seen as judge and jury at the same time for fixing a significant issue. So huge challenges for everyone. Well done on writing the document.
Echo many of my colleagues' comments here. I think it's a very good submission, and I think it's really important to actually applaud the government for the work they're doing on these big, thorny regulatory hurdles that we've had in the housing market and the way it's been functioning effectively for 30 years. You look back at the graphs around average house price growth, and that you can see it takes off basically around the same time as the Resource Management Act comes in. So that's a different story, but they are, there's a lot of focus on what the government is doing in terms of reform, and the stuff like this, the government policy statement here and the national policy statement on urban development. Those are big, big changes that they're not going to solve the housing question overnight, and that's one thing we have to be clear on. None of this will fix New Zealand's housing affordability crisis overnight, or housing access crisis overnight, but it's the stuff that will, in the long run, reposition our housing market to provide the mixture of housing that we need to support a growing population. And there's still lots of other bits that have to fit into this. We've just gotten over leaky buildings, and now we're getting onto earthquake-prone buildings, which looks like that could be as big of an issue as leaky buildings was. So there's still stuff like that has to be sorted out. But I think it's really important to signal that the government has actually done a lot of good work in this. There's high-profile things that they get a bit of stick for, like Kiwi Build, but the big regulatory stuff, they are on a good track, and I think the stuff that we're sort of inputting into this is is good, and it'll be really interesting to see what they come out with. So I think, commending to you for putting this together.
Councillor Hanford?
Yeah, I'd also just like to talk with Councillor McCann and Councillor Compton and to highlight, I think, how well put the submission summary themes were in depicting a wide range of issues but also opportunities. For example, poor decision making now could lock in poor outcomes for generations. I think that's really poignant, and we've talked about the Climate Emergency Action Framework this morning too. Poor decisions in terms of housing and how we look at designing our towns and communities and how we look at developing our urban areas is very much relevant to the climate conversation, and both could lock in poor outcomes in the housing space but also in the wider environmental field as well and sphere. So I just think that they were very well summarised, strong kind of key themes. So I would just like to thank the staff who developed the submission.
Okay, no other councillors wanting to debate this. Recommendation 26, moved by Councillor McCann, seconded by Councillor Compton. Do you want to write a reply by any chance?
Just I agree with what the other councillors said, and if my criticism of the government is about making some of those hard choices, I do have to acknowledge what Councillor Compton has said, that they are a government that's willing to have this discussion, which is a really, really difficult discussion, and we all acknowledge that.
Right, and I'll put the recommendation 26. All those in favour say aye. Aye. Those against, carried. Thank you very much, Angela. Item 9.5, reports and recommendations on standing committees and community boards. There were sort of 20 meetings. Page 173, you've got the recommendations. Can I ask the Chief Executive? That's good, then we have a silence first. When you see the council notes and the council notes and the council notes, do this noting process lead to a cul-de-sac, or is there any way of then having some kind of responses? How do we, what does that mean?
I think we probably need to look case by case. You are not, in noting it, my take would be you are asking for any feedback from staff if necessary in future. If we were, for example, looking at the first one, we are noting that the board does not support some decisions that you've made, basically. I think if I've got that one right, whereas with the second one, there is an expectation of us being able to answer that point, which we either have or haven't. I'm not sure about the underpass. I don't see stuff like that as resulting in reports with future recommendations being needed, but that staff can come back in response. That the boards want to know that the council has been made aware of those things. So not down a rabbit hole where it's never seen again, but it is not quite the same as requiring a specific action.
Councillor Rendell.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Mayor. Yeah, you've stolen my thunder, but
I did hear that sound day before, and I thought that sounds like Rendell.
Oh well, that's good, Mr. Mayor. It's good that you still have the interests of the community board at heart. So I agree, and I'm very disappointed in the way the format for this report, these reports of community board members, have changed over the, compared with the previous triennium. And the recommendations, I would suggest, and if I can move, I will move it, that the word notes be changed to recommends. I mean, previously, Mr. Mayor, when we had, in the previous triennium, the report was designed in such a way that the ward councillors would then move the resolution. It's quite a straightforward process. Does anyone agree with it? No.
Hold on. Leanne, you got a response to that? Yeah. Hold on. Leanne.
So while in this particular report there are a number of items for noting, and just the one item at the end that council receives the report. It's not unusual in other reports like this to see items for council to approve or for council to ratify if that is a requirement of that particular topic. In terms of these items, they're all items for council to note, and council can decide if they would like any further action or would like to take a different approach. But as staff, we can't advise them so to do. They need to decide for themselves. That's why for these, they are specifically for noting, but it's not unusual to see other items where appropriate for members to approve or to ratify.
Okay. Councillor McCann.
I've got a question through you, Mr. Mayor, and it relates to that notifying or ratifying or opening up discussion on these items. When is it appropriate for us to have that discussion, and in what forum to facilitate what our boards are discussing? Because I don't quite understand how the process is should work, and we've had a wider conversation about representation, which is relevant. And the issue I discussed the other day is we all say that the current system isn't specifically working and has some issues, but yet we don't seem to have a mechanism for working out how to work out what those issues were. And the answer was that's actually a mayoral decision yesterday or the day before. I don't know what the process is to actually answer what Councillor Randall is talking about.
So if I'm understanding you correctly, Councillor, it would be helpful if we could provide some parameters and direction in terms of this type of recommendation and what may appear as recommendations in this type of report, so that next steps, if there are any, can be clearer. Is that what you're asking for?
Absolutely. And would council staff, when they're putting this together, go back to the chairs and confirm that it's just for noting, or whether they're actually meaning that there should be a recommendation for action?
Okay, can I ask the Chief Executive to give some guidance here, because you would be in a better position to know what your work stream is, what are the, how well your staff will be able to manage this. Because, like I said earlier, the notes just leads into a cul-de-sac. You said, I'm not happy with your response that whether action will be done on those or rationale will be given why it cannot.
Well, I guess in some cases it's an issue of delegations. The item number 1, council process was followed and passed, and the board's really come back saying they just didn't like the outcome and they want us to be aware that they disagree with it. There's
right.
not something different there. So that one's pretty straightforward. Okay. With regard to the underpass, I'd have to test with Sean, but I'm pretty sure that would be a council or committee decision, not a community board. So we're noting what they are saying to us they would like to see happen. So I don't think it needs more work, because at the point that we do anything with that, there'll be a report and it will be able to take note of the community board. With regard to the third one, there's an ongoing debate around who and how people want to see this dealt with. There's a resource consent condition, so the regulatory team is in discussion about what's appropriate in terms of that request. And so at the moment I don't think there's anything more to note, because I don't think we can come back and tell you what our advice will be on it. So sort of to semi-answer Councillor McCann's question and your comment, you are here taking these recommendations now. If you wish to revise them, now is the time you would do that. Then we'd have to come back and tell you how we would deal with that based on what you've put. So clearly we've put as a starting point, note that. If you want to see a different resolution, now's the time for you to do that. I hope that helps.
Yes, it does. So can we look at the first recommendation then?
You've got a few people.
Oh, sorry.
Sorry.
Councillor Coates.
Sorry, Your Worship. I have a question. Oh, a couple of questions actually. And as Councillor McCann would say, I'm trying to be, I guess, helpful here, or looking for some help myself, because one of them refers to Otaki. We've come up against a similar situation around a significant topic, which was the Peka Peka interchange, and those motions that were put through from the community board were simply noted, and that was by myself in terms of moving the recommendation. The advice that we'd had was that as a standard procedure, staff note the recommendations, and so in that instance they didn't deliberately note them, they just did what they always do, and as they've done here. So it'd be helpful to know, because I've kind of heard some variations of that a little bit today, maybe I've misheard it. Is that actually the case, that the reports from community boards, the recommendations and so forth, as a standard procedure are noted, and then it is up to this table to make a change about whether they want to do something further with that? And then I have a follow-up question around item number 3.
No, it isn't a standard procedure. A recommendation would say approve, or it would say ratify. If the original recommendation from the community board had suggested that wording, whether that was correct or not, and it would also include approve or ratify if it was around something that required council approval or ratification according to delegation and standing orders. Other than that, if it's something that council simply needs to be made aware of, as a number of these items are, then it just appears as noting. Is that helpful?
Yes. Hopefully I'm not getting out of line now.
And I'm not saying I disagree, I'm just really wanting clarity.
My take on pretty much all of these things is they weren't the subject of a report at the community board either. So when these things come up out of nowhere, it's the same as the debate we've had here today. We can't accept recommendations unless they're accompanied or a result from a report. So really, it would be helpful if chairs sort of say, I want to request a report, and we can look at whether that's appropriate, for example. So I hope that helps a little bit, that sort of the vagueness of all of this. Noting is a good response when they've moved a motion out of nowhere without an accompanying report that's gone through the pros and cons.
Yeah, sure. And me raising it isn't to raise the issue of the Peka Peka interchange. I'll bring that up through a more appropriate process and already had discussions around that. Partly the reason why I raise it is also because item number 3 refers to the Otaki Community Board. The risk that I face here, and I'm just being honest, is if we just pass this, I'll end up in the same situation as the Peka Peka interchange, whereas the councillor for the ward, and whether it be me or Jocelyn or anyone else on any other topic, has simply noted this and nothing further happens about that, and then I'm in the gun because I didn't do anything about it. So I do need some advice from staff in terms of that particular recommendation, understanding the concerns that were raised in the community, the request for that review, understanding some staff feedback around the appropriateness of the length and depth of the review. What do I need to do to give effect to that without stepping across the line in terms of not having a full report and so forth?
I think
at the moment, if I just note it, nothing further will happen.
Councillor Coates, I think you touched an important point. That is, particularly, and that's the reason why you have councillors appointed to their respective community boards, the ward councillors. It will be useful for the ward councillors to know, yes, the council notes the following recommendations, and be able to then say what other actions needed to be done or advice needed to be done to go back to those community boards. I think that's lacking.
My understanding is if we move these as they sit today, nothing further will happen for those that are noted. We're simply saying thank you, we note that, and then we move on. So I need some direction as to what I'm supposed to do otherwise if I'm to go to effect.
That's not 100% correct. What I said about that one is the regulatory team is currently looking at that request, and there's a lot of toing and froing going on, and a crap load of staff time behind the scenes being involved with one individual who wants to do this. So no, it isn't that nothing's going on. There isn't a discrete outcome sought when you are noting. As our way of saying, we'll come back to you and let you know what happens after that truckload of staff time has been spent on addressing the matter. What I suggest in that specific instance, because I'm totally aware of your issue, Councillor, and I'm sympathetic to it, if you like, at the bottom of that, you could put something, whether it's a resolution or simply a request, that the council requests a report from staff on the matter. And that will resolve that, because you'll know that that's going to come back, and we'll tell you how and when.
Okay.
If that helps.
Look, again, I was looking for your guidance, or guidance from the
Understood.
organisation. So if we could run with the words to that effect, that the council requests further information or report on item number 3, then if other councillors support that.
So can we wait for them to, let me just manage the first
Yes,
one.
didn't want to lose that.
So on the first recommendation, the Paraparaumu Ramaiti Community Board. Kathy, have you got anything to say on this?
Well, I just wanted to say that with the first one, that would have been at a community board meeting before the LTP was adopted. And I do know that it's an operational matter, the beach bylaw with the closing off, and staff are still going to be talking to targeted people, which I assume are the Kapiti Boating Club and the Manly Street North residents, whom I spoke to one of them a couple of days ago, and they have not yet been contacted by staff. But as community boards are advocates for our community, and when things come like this to council, if councils have to make a decision on it later, like number 2, it's the community boards are listening to the community. So I guess from my perspective, we're hoping that the councillors take note of this has come from the community, and this is what the community is saying, and would kind of take note of that and have that in mind if a decision had to be made later on.
So can I ask you that you're quite happy for recommendation 1 and 2, that council notes the specific recommendation that we noted?
Well, the Councillor Randall wants to make an adjustment, but an amendment. But I was going to say something else there as well. So with item number 2, I know we're having a presentation on the 17th of August, and it's coming to the Paraparaumu Ramaiti Community Board. But initially, my understanding was that councillors were going to make a decision on whether the underpass was closed or not. And I don't know if that's still the case or not.
But given that there's still work under progress, you are happy with council noting this specific item 2?
Yeah, yes, because I think, we're hoping that the councillors sitting around the table are listening to the community.
That's right. We are noting it, that we are listening to it, and there's ongoing work done.
If it's a staff.
Councillor Randall, you.
Well, I can't disagree with my chair of the community board publicly, Mr. Mayor.
Well, it's great that publicly you don't disagree. So all power to the community board chair. So I think those 2 are resolved. That it's noted. 3, we got James. Or shall I just deal with 1 and 2 first, and I come back to you? So, Councillor Randall, would you like to move the recommendation 1 and 2?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Right, and I will second that. So, all those in favour of recommendation 1 and 2, moved by Councillor Randall, seconded by the Mayor, say aye. Aye. Again, so that's done. Item 3. Kristen Pabs, can I go to you first?
James has covered off just about everything, but just to clarify, we had a very big delegation come to our last board meeting on this, and I've spoken to Sean, and it sounds like they are dealing with it. The chair of that CLG, she's quite open to it actually being made clearer. There isn't a lot of clarity around the terms of reference. There is no requirement in the terms of reference for a board member to be on that community liaison group, and the chair feels there should be. I'm either one way or the other on it. So it would just help, because as I say, we did have a big delegation come, led by one particular person, and we really do need some sort of resolution to this, something to take back, because I know we are going to have more people at next week's meeting in regards to this and another issue that has come up. So just so that we've got something to take back, that's
so the question that I'm going to put to you is,
clarity, that's all.
Yeah, the question I'm going to put to you is whether you are happy with the current recommendation that we note this recommendation from your board. If you're happy with that, then we can pass it. Then James, I'll ask James to respond. James.
or simply just repeating what we said earlier around requesting further information or a report on item number 3 within the recommendations around the Ashford Park Community Liaison Group.
So would it be that the council notes the following recommendation and request?
Yeah.
Right?
Sure.
That's what you'd like, I think, isn't it?
Yeah. So and request what? A report.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's up to, I'm looking for direction from the staff if it's further information or if it's a report. They're two different things.
A report, yeah.
Okay,
Do a
thank
report.
you.
We've been, as you said, we've been down this rabbit hole.
So
Yeah.
with that amendment, the recommendation 3 moved by Councillor Coates. Can I have a seconder? Don't anybody rush. Oh, Councillor Elliott. All those in favour say aye. Aye. Carried. Recommendation number 4 that the council receives its report. I'll move that. Can I have a seconder?
No, can we just stop to make it dismissed because we're trying to get the reading
Councillor Randall.
Councillor Randall and Councillor Mann who read it first. And then also Ed. Myself and Councillor.
We're going to have debate on that though, or
On the 3. Right, so it's up there, moved by Councillor Coates, seconded by Councillor Elliott. Do you want to talk on that? No?
You've actually got a vote on it, Mr. Mayor. We were just updating who moved to second. So we're up to recommendation 4, sorry. You do it.
No, but recommendation 3, we haven't actually voted on it.
You did.
Oh, we did?
Yeah.
Must be getting... Okay, recommendation 4, moved by the Mayor. Can I have a seconder? Councillor Compton. All those in favour say aye. Aye. Those against? Carried. Items, public speaking time for items not on the...
Mr. Mayor,
Yep.
I wish to ask.
You have what?
I wish to make some comments
On what?
on the recommendations from community boards.
Well, we've just completed that section.
I've had my button pressed for quite some time. In fact, I turned it off because other people spoke. That's how long I've been speaking, but been wishing to speak. So really, it's just to say that...
So you just want to make a general comment in between item 9.5 and item 6.
It's about, I suppose, how we're going to receive clarity on when a recommendation from a community board, when they're actually asking for a request actually comes through, in terms of what noting made actually means. For example, who actually makes that call. And I think it's been suggested that the community, that council has received some clarification on that too, but I think also the community board need to know that as well. Particularly, they're the ones who set up who basically recommend or suggest what's going on their agendas. And if there's an item that needs to have a report, then they need to be aware of it, or whether a report isn't actually needed. To me, that seems quite bureaucratic, but so I think it'd be good to have some really good clarity for all of the elected members on this, please.
Am I correct that earlier on Leanne did mention, can you repeat that?
Yeah, I do understand from the conversations that have happened around the table this morning that members are really looking for some clarification and guidance around that section of recommendations in this report that comes through every few weeks. So we'll look to pull some information together and we'll email that out after just discussion with SLT, so we know that everybody's on the same page.
Yeah, thank you. I think when that conversation was had, it was only with councillors, but also the community boards need to be included. If I may ask,
Can I just add to that it's the really the responsibility of the ward councillors to be working quite closely with the community board chairs and community boards, especially in this particular area, to ensure that you midwife what their issues are successfully through the process we've got around the council table.
Yeah, well, I missed it.
And if you've got issues earlier on, raise it with the democratic services.
So I have to say I had a conversation about the wording of these recommendations, and that's why this conversation has occurred today. Thank you.
Thank you. The next item, public speaking time for items not on the agenda. There's nothing there. It's gone. I think you thought wrong. I now move that we go into public exclusion. And this matter is not urgent in the sense that community boards need to leave. It is not. You can stay. Community board chairs can stay if they want to. It is just a standard.
Councillor Buswell.
Seconded by Councillor Buswell. All those in favour say aye. Those against. We are now in public exclusion. Who's speaking on this one?
Me.
Oh, you. Where you go.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. There's nothing to add to the report. I'm happy to take any questions through the Mayor.
So you're not really speaking to it, eh? You've got nothing to say.
There's nothing's changed.